If you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role within the wider prospects of landscape architecture.
Sure. So my name is Jane Hutton, and I teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Design in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my role within the broader discipline of landscape architecture, I'm primarily a researcher right now. I've practiced for 5 years in Toronto. I was educated at the University of Toronto. But right now I'm doing research about construction materials, and I suppose that's a kind of, interaction with practice in terms of thinking about the way that the materials that people build with have broader implications.
When and how did you first discover landscape architecture?
I did a bachelor's in biology and environmental science at McGill in Montreal. And I didn't know, I'd never heard about it at all. And I used to do my biology homework in the architecture library, and I came across some periodicals. And at the time I was working in a conservation biology lab, and the research that I was involved with was about the harvesting of palm trees in eastern Panama.
Okay.
And it was a scientific context, but the research was very much about a social reality. So the people that we were working with were an indigenous group of people who use palms and other plants for building their homes and for selling things. This is a bit of a long story, but there's a point.
Yeah.
So in that program, this was considered not really ecology because it involved people. It wasn't just purely plants and non-human animals.
Yeah.
And so I was just really interested in the way people use or are part of ecology. And so I started to think about landscape architecture as that. So I really didn't come at it from a design perspective at all. I initially wasn't that interested in the cultural dimension of it. I was just thinking about it as like a different form of ecology.
How did you manage your own individual design and career development whilst at university? And what inspired you most?
The first summer I found an internship in Mexico City, which was a city that I was really interested in, and that was dealing with, the office that I was working with was dealing with like city scale projects. And then I spent one summer in Chongqing working with an office that was dealing with Chongqing, China, that was dealing with the kind of historic preservation of an old wall. And for me, these were really important experiences which really affected the way I understood my studio work, I think. Yeah.
After graduating, did you experience any gender bias or inequality within a profession?
I think that there is gender bias in every dimension, or there are structural biases of all forms, and gender bias is a big one. And I think that's very prominent in the fields of design. I mean, it's prominent in many everywhere. Yeah, but it is has a serious role and history in architecture and landscape architecture, and it's something that I think everybody has to constantly address and talk about. It's great that this is the fourth question on your interview. It really needs to be made present. And one of the things that I was interested in, actually, a lot of the students that I teach talk about, is looking for, to understand opportunities to work with women practitioners and women-led design firms. I think there are many. I mean, there are a few in the big scheme of things, but I know I myself sought out an office to work with, which had 3 partners. 2 of them were women, and have looked to work with a lot of people that I found inspiring on that level. Yeah.
Statistics show that student members on landscape architecture courses are often lower than in other areas of design. Is this the same in the USA?
My understanding is that has a historical, there's a historical reason for that. I mean, the discipline, as far as the professional practice there are a smaller number of landscape architects, but I would say that's something that has changed a lot. It's kind of become clearer that urban issues need to be addressed outside of the scale of the building. So there have always been urban designers to do that, but the fact that those projects involve biophysical systems, water, animals, and the kind of the synthesis of that. I think, in general, landscape architecture has taken a kind of more central role in some of those projects. I wouldn't say there's an inversion.
So it's not purely just design based. It can also branch out to incorporate ideas and other elements of ecology.
Yeah, I think that that's a much more commonly understood necessity now. That it's really like the city is not just a series of objects. It's about the systems that bring them together, and landscape architects are really good at conceiving of that and designing for that. So I think that some of those stereotypes are kind of by necessity changing quite a lot.
What do you feel is to be gained from the increased presence of a landscape architect working in a multidisciplinary design environment?
I mean, I think if the architectural project is changing to involve these larger systems or more dynamic systems, that it's kind of it's inevitable that a range of expertise is required. Like even within a landscape architecture office, many firms today have a staff of landscape architects, but they will hire an architect, they will hire an urban designer, they will hire a wildlife specialist, they'll hire a structural engineer, or whether that's within the office or more like on a per project basis. I think there's as is kind of like much discussed, a necessity for interdisciplinary work, and the fact that kind of no discipline can do all of that. And it's more about like building up really strong understanding of someone else's expertise, but also the ability to like make space for that person's expertise. That the landscape architect can't be everything, and the architect can't be everything. So finding ways for like mutual respect and like generative relationships are really important.
In your research, you have been examining the expended consequences of material practice in landscape architecture and the link between the spatial and social forms of the sites of production and consumption. How do you feel a sense of place can be best reimagined to accommodate the underlying social aspects of a city like London, where its inhabitants' socio-economic background is as diverse as it is multiculturally rich?
I think that's an amazing question. I mean, I think I don't have an answer for that, except to say that that's the right question. That's a bit of a cop-out. But I think like what's at stake in the opposite? What's at stake if you don't consider the richness in terms of people's cultural backgrounds, their needs, their needs for public space, the way in which the idea or the significance of cultural backgrounds is really important, because people that have different traditions use landscape or use different plants, have different relationships to to outside space, and so it's a really important consideration on a programmatic level, but also a material level. Like, what do you plant? At stake in ignoring those issues is a very homogeneous and sterile world, and so we can't risk that. And so I think that's the question that design work needs to be passed through always. Yeah.
Okay. Which project that you have designed and or led do you feel has been the most beneficial impact on the lives of its inhabitants?
Well, you just mentioned the Nathan Phillips Square project, which is a project that when I was working with Plant Architect in Toronto, was a collaboration with Plant Architect and the architects Shore Tilby Irwin and Adrian Blackwell Urban Design. And that was a really significant project for me to be involved with in my career. But I also think it's a very symbolic project for Toronto, because it's the City Hall, first of all, but also because it's a space that many different people use in different ways, and part of the kind of idea behind the project was to clear it, to like allow for rather than to like fill up the square with a lot of stuff, was to make space for large demonstration or large gatherings and events. And it's really wonderful to see that when that does happen. It's exciting because I think rather than seeing the thing that you designed, you see the life that happens in it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot more exciting.
Landscapes come and go whilst evolving to the needs and requirements of those who use them. How do you feel we as landscape architects must ensure that our urban and rural habitats are protected for future generations?
You know, this morning in my email I received there was an article in The Guardian this morning about this. It was called How London Has Privatized Itself to Death, which I think, very punchy, I think is typical in many cities, but it's interesting that you have this question, and obviously that must be a big concern as a designer working here. And I guess I don't know enough about the exact conditions of what's happening in London, but I think, designers have a role to play in advocacy. It sounds like you have, that's great.
Myself.
It's great. I bet you have. I would love to actually know what you think about that. I mean, all I can say is that from my point of view, through my own interests, but also my experience as a designer, I do think that there's a strong responsibility to, rather than simply just receiving briefs. If you're working as a designer, it's very hard to get to control what design briefs are on the table. Like, the design briefs are the ones coming from the privatized development. They're not necessarily coming from the projects that you wish you were designing for, and so that's a conflict in some way. Yeah, but I think a part of the work has to be finding ways to organize and advocate for the role of social housing in the urban landscape, and to kind of engage in other political struggles which are about space. So you come to it as a spatial thinker that can really contribute something to those issues, and to give it presence in the media, in your media, and the work that you do academically and professionally, so that it becomes more relevance to designers around you. I think that's great, and I think it's really important. And it's a struggle. Like, I think it's hard to make a living, but really essential to think about what you would like to be doing as a designer.
So it all comes down to consciousness and ethics. The role of
and maybe doing some things that you're not necessarily getting paid for, or joining forces with others, with housing activists, and trying to figure out how you as a designer can support their work through drawings and their work in advocacy. Like, it's kind of about solidarities that you might have with those movements.